Andrew Dolkart has been active in historic preservation in New York City for over 30 years. Director of the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia, member of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, prolific writer and teacher, Mr. Dolkart has been a longtime consultant to the Tenement Museum and is author of the award-winning Biography of a Tenement House, an architectural history of 97 Orchard. Our esteemed colleagues in the Education and Curatorial Departments, Annie Pollan, VP of Education, and Dave Favallaro, Director of Curatorial Affairs, collaborated with Mr. Dolkart to develop an architectural tour for the Tenement Museum. Tonight, Annie Pollan and Andrew Dolkart will offer an exclusive insider scoop on how that tour was developed.
Thank you. This is something that I've been very interested in for a long time. I have been involved with the Tenement Museum almost from day one. And I remember the first time I walked into the building and was so struck by the power of the ruin that it was at the time. And then over the course of many years, as I was part of a team that did the research on the building from all different perspectives, more and more questions arose. Of course, more and more answers were found, and of course, every answer always led to more questions. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting was how we learned from the physical fabric of the building. And I think that that was the root of this idea of doing an exhibition that interpreted the physical fabric of the building, that would help people understand what they could learn from the physical fabric, both by just looking at things, really tuning in to getting their eyes to focus on what was there. So by just looking, by using documentary resources, by using investigative resources, by using cultural history and social history issues, and so bringing all these things together. And we thought that it would be interesting to explain to people how this worked, both so they could understand the process, they could understand more about the architecture, and more importantly, I think, the physical fabric of the building, more than just the architecture of the building. I think people think of architecture as a word that's limiting, but it's all about the very physical fabric of the building, and also think about how they might be able to do this on their own buildings. So this idea of doing this kind of interactive exhibition, basically reading the building. And this is an idea, a term I really like. I like the idea that you can read a building or you can read the city. And if you understand the words, you can really learn an incredible amount. So here we are at the Tenement Museum. The building, you all know, an up-to-date picture, in fact, taken yesterday. The Gumpert's apartment, the first apartment that was done, an apartment that, as we will see, fraught with problems. The tour is going to start, of course, on the outside of the building. And it will be about actually looking at a facade and what you can see from the facade. So the idea is that the museum educator who's leading the tour will ask the group about what the character of the facade is. And of course, basically, it's a 5-story building. It's got a brick facade. It's 4 windows wide. It's got it's a 5-story building with a raised basement. It's got a storefront on the first floor and the basement. If you look a little bit more carefully and you know a few architectural words, or even if you don't, the educator can mention these words. It's got a projecting cornice at the top, and it's got stone window sills and window lintels, the member over the window. So it's very simple, basically a very, very simple building. And it's got a fire escape also, very prominent. So the first question is, how does the building today differ from the building that was built in the 1860s, and why does the building look the way it does? So everybody's going to have the 1939 tax photo. In 1939, New York City photographed every lot in New York. And fortunately, these photographs still exist. They're on microfilm at the Municipal Archives. One can order an original, and they vary in condition. They were not cared for many years, and a lot of them got moldy, and they've got mold speckles on them. But many of them do exist. They were not taken by great photographers, so sometimes you learn a lot, and sometimes there's a truck parked in front of the building, and you really want to know what the main entrance looked like, but the truck is in the way. They didn't wait for the truck to leave. So here's the tax photo for our building. And there are things that are, basically it's the same building. These are the kinds of things that people are going to get in their packet. They're going to have a tax photo. They're going to have this photo of the Rogaszewskis standing in front of the stoop to 97 Orchard Street. They're going to have an iCard which has information about the building in 1902 and a plan from 1902. These were done by the Tenement House department, which was founded in 1901. They surveyed every single tenement in New York, and they filled out these forms, and they drew these little plans, and they're an amazing resource. It's now online. When we discovered these, they were hidden away at the Department of Health or some outlandish place, but now they're more available. They'll have advertisements, pages from trade catalogs. We'll get back to all of these. So and then they'll be investigating the facade. So you'll be comparing the building and the 1939 photograph of the building. And there are a number of things that hopefully people will notice are different about the buildings. One is the fire escape. I think New Yorkers know, if you ask any New Yorker, they'll tell you that all these buildings have fire escapes, but nobody ever looks at the fire escapes because it's such a common feature of the city. So of course this is a typical fire escape with flights of stairs on it and balconies on it. And if you look, the design of the balcony railings here on our present fire escape is exactly like the design of the balcony railings on the 1939 one. But if you look carefully, you'll see the stairs are not there. Instead, this was what was known as a fire ladder. And there's a ladder going all the way up here. And this was on the building until at least about 1980. And so this brings up an interesting issue that the educators can discuss with people. Why a fire ladder versus fire stairs? Why did reformers hate the fire ladders and really advocate for their being banned, which eventually they were, but if you had one, it was grandfathered in. So in fact, there are still a few around the city. And of course, if you had 3 babies and there was a fire, how were you going to get them down on the fire stair? Or if you were really elderly, how were you going to get down a stair? And it must have been incredibly slow to get down. So the building's burning down, and people are trying to figure out how to get down this ladder. So it wasn't exactly the most efficient way of fighting fire, but it's a really key thing. This is an early 1860s fire escape here, and then how reforms evolved to create fire escapes that were safer and easier for people to get out of. So that's one really interesting issue that can be discussed. The other is, if you look really carefully at the windows, you can see that there used to be, that these look like they're deteriorated, or in fact they've been shaved. You can even see that it looks like they had little brackets under here. So, and if you look at the picture, you can see that the window lintels and the window sills are 3-dimensional, that they actually once projected out, and that at some point they were just shaved back because the brownstone was deteriorating. So that brings up the issue of brownstone. And if you're a New Yorker, of course you know that New Yorkers refer to all row houses as brownstones, whether they're brick or limestone or whatever. But the reason for it, of course, is that the material was so common in the mid-19th century. It was a sandstone, mostly from Connecticut, that was used extensively because it was easy to get here. But it's a soft stone and it deteriorates. So it was being used here. So we can talk about what brownstone is and why it was used here. how it deteriorated and how they shaved them back, but how this kind of design with the projecting lintels and sills and the arched windows here was very fashionable at the time, and how brownstone was used on tens of thousands of single-family homes, especially surviving in Brooklyn. There were many in Manhattan, but not as many survived. So here's typical brownstones. These happen to be in Fort Greene in Brooklyn, with a lot of the same motifs that you see on our tenement. So what did this building look like when it had the three-dimensional window lintels and sills? Well, if you look on, if we're standing in front of the tenement and you turn around and you look on the east side of the street, you'll see this building, which is almost identical to 97 Orchard Street. In fact, when I was putting in my slides, when I was putting my slideshow together, I accidentally put this in as the opening shot because it looks so much, it's easy to confuse them. But this has its window lintels and sills still surviving. And you get a sense of the three-dimensionality that the building would have had. Now, the reason why these survive is that these are actually made out of cast iron. And they did not deteriorate in the way the brownstone ones did. They look pretty much the same. Actually, they're probably a little fancier because it didn't cost anything to cast fancy detail. But I mean, right there on the street is almost an identical building that really gives you a good contrast. The other thing that's interesting is that both of these buildings, our tenement and its twin, or once twin, and these row houses here are capped by projecting cornices with brackets on them. And they're almost identical. This is a cornice in Clinton Hill in Brooklyn, and here's our cornice here. So this brings up a really interesting issue that I pondered for a long time. If I was asked what style is this, I would say that these are Italianate style buildings. This was the style that was popular in New York beginning in the late 1840s and going through the 1860s, and it often has arched windows and three-dimensional carved detail and these cornices with brackets with leaves on them. You can see there's leaf decoration here. Panels, very, very similar, these two. So was the builder who put up 97 Orchard Street, and there may have been an architect, we don't know, because the building was built before records were kept. But most tenements that were built in here after 1865, when records started to be kept, have an architect's name associated with them. Usually German immigrants, probably of very little training, and they were working at the absolute lowest end of the architectural world. Well, did these people design in the sense that we think of design today? No, I don't think they did. But they knew how to go to a building yard and buy materials. And that's what they did. So you went to a building yard and you needed a cornice, and so you bought a cornice. And of course, the cornice that was for sale was the cornice that was in fashion. So I don't think they were trying to build a fashionable, stylish building, but they ended up with fashionable, stylish detail here. So it's a really interesting concept for people to get their hands around about how you could use fashionable detail without the intent of designing the latest high-style design. The other thing that is interesting, of course, on the exterior that's worth discussing are the storefronts. Originally, there were stores in the basement of the building, but there were apartments on the first floor. And we know from documentary evidence that in 1905, the owner of the building applied to the Department of Buildings to convert the four apartments on the first floor into 2 stores, and applied for a permit to build a new storefront. So there's the whole issue of why, and I think that that's an interesting question to ask people. Why would the owner have decided to get rid of the 4 apartments on the first floor and put in stores? And of course, we don't have the owner's record that says this is why I did it, but one can imagine that he must have thought he could make more money renting the stores than he could renting the apartments. That the stores probably paid higher rent, They didn't. People didn't come and go quite as often. The store might be more stable. Also, the apartments on the first floor were particularly tiny. We know all the apartments were small, but the ones on the first floor, because it has the hall going right through, were very, very narrow. So they were the least desirable apartments in the building. So easier to turn them into stores. So suddenly you had 4 stores in the building. So the storefront was built out of inexpensive wood that was then painted to look like it was more expensive. So this introduces the issue of wood graining, of the art of turning something inexpensive into something that looked a little bit more expensive. Now, of course, they couldn't afford to hire the most sophisticated grainers, so the graining is kind of crude on the building, but it's still giving you the illusion of a more expensive material here. And then you can see this is the restored. It was restored pretty accurately to the graining. So the next question is the stoop here, and this is one of the great stories of accidental finds at the tenement. The stoop had been altered. Here you can see the owner of the building, whom the museum bought the building from, standing up here. And I know it's hard to see, but the stairs are concrete, and there's a very simple railing over here. There isn't really a good photo of this. And here's the restored stoop. Well, here's the Rogoshevskys standing photographed in front of the building. The Rogoshevskys are one of the families whose one of the apartments interprets. And fortunately for us, they're not centered in front of the stoop, because there is this great photograph that shows the railing, shows the steps, and it actually shows pieces of the railings to either side as well. And using this image and putting it on a computer, comparing it to other stoops, other iron stoops that still survive in the area, the museum was able to reconstruct the original stoop to look very much as it did originally. It's because the pictures aren't as clear as I would have hoped. Actually, one of the interesting things is there are little holes in the stairs, and they actually appear. The little holes are evident over here. So it's just a little family snapshot. And the stoop was meaningless to the Rogoshevskys. It was clearly about the family. Yet, it's an incredibly valuable document, this little family snapshot, that one of the very few images of the stoop that survived, and it was able to be used to help to recreate the building. So you never know what's going to be important. So then the tour is going to go inside the building, and it's going to look at the hall. And as Annie said, in the introduction, the museum is about layering and about interpreting the layers. I always like to talk about the museum as being a place of time travel, that you can move from the 1860s and then 2 seconds later in the 1930s. And I think that's one of the really dynamic things about the building. And so sometimes there are some things that are interpreted in a particular time, one particular time, and there are other things that are all about interpreting the overlays through time and how you can read the changes that went on here. And the hall is a spectacular example of that because there's evidence of the 1863 construction of the building, major alterations that went on probably in about 1905, other changes over the years that took place, as well as new interventions that were made by the museum. That are also evident. So one of the ideas was to bring people into the hall and ask them to look around and see what they can see without any of the evidence. What do they think is original in the building and or has changed over the years? Just to get people to focus on all these details that are around them that they might just walk by at any time. So the most prominent original features are this arch here, which you can see over there, and the stair rail which I don't have a picture of here. And actually the pine boards also are original from the 1860s. There are also some more subtle things. There's one original apartment door that still survives. It's actually the only completely original door that survives in the building.